Hello everyone. Tonight, we drift back into a world where the air tastes faintly of ash. Books are bound in leather and secrets, and a single candle flickers over scrolls older than memory. You descend creaking steps into a stone-walled cellar beneath a crooked tower. The air is heavy with the scent of sulfur and ancient ink. Glass bottles line the walls, some filled with powder, others with smoke. One bottle has something that looks suspiciously like a pickled eyeball, but you decide not to ask. You're in an alchemist's laboratory. The room is lit only by the soft glow of firelight and the occasional spark from a forge no one has stoked in hours. There's a table cluttered with metal tools, folded parchment, and strange runes scrawled in 3 different languages. There's no modern hum here, no electricity. Just the tick of your breath and the quiet promise that something impossible is being attempted. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. That's always a quiet joy for me to see. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You run your fingers across the edge of a brass alembic still warm from use. Its spout curls like a question mark. Next to it, a shallow ceramic bowl holds a grayish lump lead, heavy, dull, unremarkable. And yet, for more than 1,000 years, people believed that with enough time, patience, and divine insight, you could turn it into gold. Not paint it, not fake it, actually change it. Element into element, matter into meaning, lead into light. Why you settle into the corner of the room as a robed figure, half wizard, half chemist, leans over the workbench. He isn't cackling maniacally. He's muttering about ratios. His hair is singed. His ink-stained hands tremble not from madness, but from fatigue and expectation. On the wall behind him, an astrological chart hangs beside a crucifix. A contradiction not for an alchemist. Because this man doesn't just believe in science. He believes in transformation. Historians agree that the root of alchemy stretches far back into antiquity, long before the Middle Ages turned it into a shadowy art. Ancient Egypt, Babylon, India, China all had traditions of metalwork medicine and spiritual refinement that hinted at the alchemical ideal. But in the medieval world, especially in Europe, alchemy became more than technique. It became obsession. And it all begins with that lump of lead. Lead is the ultimate base metal, cheap, soft, easy to work with, and symbolically heavy. To the alchemist, it wasn't just worthless, it was unfinished. Crude, a soul in need of purification. And gold. Well, gold wasn't just expensive, it was perfect. Immune to rust, untouched by time. A symbol of the divine itself. If lead was the sinner, gold was the saint. So you can see the appeal. But here's the first twist. It wasn't always about money. Sure, turning lead into gold would have made you rich. Yes, some people tried it for that reason. But the true believers, they wanted more. They believed that transmuting metal was a mirror of the self. That if you could purify lead, you could purify your soul. A quirky fact, some alchemists used urine in their recipes. Not metaphorically, literally. Human waste was believed to carry life essence, and yes, it occasionally worked in surprising ways. Just don't ask what that yellow powder is in the jar by your elbow. You glance at a crumbling parchment labeled Prima Materia, the first matter. The chaos before creation. According to alchemical tradition, everything comes from this. If you could distill it, control it, you could make anything. It's not science, not yet. But it's not madness either. It's hope bottled and boiled and scribbled in marginalia. Historians still argue whether medieval alchemists were true proto-scientists or just misguided mystics. Were they chasing knowledge or illusion? Maybe both. After all, how many modern scientists have spent decades chasing invisible particles through billion-dollar tunnels? It's easy to mock the past, but alchemy, in its strange way, was a spark that lit the fuse. You lean closer to the furnace. The lead begins to sweat, not melt, just tremble. A shimmer rises like heat from summer stone. The alchemist hums a tune, ancient and off-key. You realize he's not expecting a miracle today or tomorrow. He's willing to work his whole life for one glimpse of truth. And maybe that's why they believed. Not because they were naive, but because the world was so brutal, so unfinished, they had to believe it could change. And in the flicker of that candlelight, watching lead glisten like it's almost gold, you believe it too. You pick up the lead again. It's heavier than it looks, dense, cold, utterly unromantic. No sparkle, no shine. Just a small gray chunk of compressed disappointment. And yet, you hold it like it matters. Like it's already halfway to becoming something else. You roll it in your palm. It stains your fingers faintly. And still you stare at it with the kind of reverence you'd usually reserve for, say, a newborn baby or a scratch-off ticket that almost won. Because this dull lump is the starting point of alchemy's most impossible dream. Across the workbench, notes are scattered in every direction. Diagrams of furnaces and crucibles, arrows pointing at circles, circles inside triangles, triangles inside squares, every page marked with words you almost recognize, but not quite. Calcination, coagulation, sublimation, transmutation. It's part chemistry, part poetry, part something else entirely. And in the margins, scribbled in the same frantic ink, solve, et coagula, dissolve, and combine. That's what alchemists believed they were doing. Not just melting things, not just mixing powders, but breaking reality apart and then putting it back together better. You glance over at a larger sheet of parchment nailed to the wall. At the top, written in bold ink, a phrase, "as above, so below." You've heard it before, maybe in a yoga class or on a tattoo. But here in this place, it takes on new weight. To the alchemist, this wasn't just a saying. It was a universal law. The movements of stars mirrored in the movements of cells. The transformation of a metal in your hand reflected the transformation of your spirit. Microcosm and macrocosm locked in a cosmic echo. Historians widely accept that this idea, first articulated in the Hermetic texts, became the backbone of alchemical philosophy. Hermeticism, a mix of Egyptian wisdom, Greek thought, and who knows what mystical flair, argued that everything in the universe was connected. That to understand one thing deeply was to understand everything. So when you stare at a lump of lead long enough, you're not just seeing a chemical. You're seeing the entire universe struggling to become itself. Here's a quirky detail for you. Many alchemists worked in total secrecy, encoding their work in elaborate metaphors. You didn't write mix sulfur with mercury. You wrote, "When the red lion devours the white queen, the child of light shall be born," which is objectively more fun than most chemistry textbooks. And confusing. There are entire books written just to interpret other books of alchemy. And even then, scholars still argue whether the texts were literal metaphorical or just one long symbolic prank. You run your finger along a line of script that spirals inward like a snail shell. It ends in a circle. Inside the circle, a dot that you've been told is the symbol for gold. Perfection, the final stage. The alchemists called it the great work, the magnum opus. Not a potion, not a trick, a process. Slow, painful, full of failure, but worth it. You imagine spending your whole life chasing this, knowing most of your peers will think you're mad. Knowing your neighbors are more interested in whether your pigs are healthy than whether your lead is singing. Knowing you'll likely die with stained hands and an unfinished notebook. And still you pursue it. Because in a world ruled by plague war, the kind of winters that kill crops and cousins alike, the idea that something ugly could become something beautiful was irresistible. Historians still debate whether alchemists believed in literal transformation or symbolic ascension. Some were deeply spiritual. Others just wanted a better metal to bribe the tax collector. Some likely hoped for both. But here's the twist, lead. And gold aren't that different, atomically speaking. On the periodic table, they're right next to each other. If you could just subtract a few protons from one or add them to the other, you'd have it. And guess what? In modern nuclear labs, we've done exactly that. Scientists have turned bismuth into gold using particle accelerators. Granted, it cost more than the gold was worth and took enough electricity to power a small village, but still, it worked. So maybe those old alchemists weren't so far off. You return your gaze to the lead. It hasn't changed, not physically, but something about the way you're looking at it has. It's no longer just matter. It's potential. You place it gently back on the table and whisper, half a joke, half a prayer. Let's try again tomorrow. Because you've come to understand what the alchemists knew all along. Gold wasn't the goal. The candle burns lower now. The shadows stretch farther. You sit in the alchemist's chamber, listening to the hiss of something simmering in a copper pan that you're half sure shouldn't be left unattended. But the alchemist doesn't seem worried. He's too busy drawing a circle inside a square, then placing a triangle inside the circle, then inserting a dot at the center. It looks like geometry. But to him, it's a cosmic map. This is the world of the Hermetic axiom, as above, so below. You've heard it, haven't you? Maybe passed it on a scroll or whispered in a bookshop. But here it's lived. The stars overhead matter just as much as the powders in the crucible. If Mercury the god governs Mercury the metal, and Saturn's influence echoes in, then everything the heavens, the earth, your body, your sins, is connected in an invisible latticework of transformation. And if that sounds overwhelming, welcome to alchemy. You open a thick, dusty volume and flip through its pages. Every page seems to have been illustrated by someone having a spiritual breakdown with a decent art budget. There's a man with a sun for a head, a dragon devouring itself, a king being dissolved in a bath of green acid while smiling politely. And on every page gold. Not always literal. Sometimes it's a golden egg, or golden tears, or a golden city in the distance. But always, always gold is the final image. Because in alchemy, gold isn't just what's valuable, it's what's true. The purest form of matter. The final evolution of substance. If base metals are messy souls, then gold is enlightenment made solid. Historians agree that this cosmological system came together during the fusion of Egyptian metallurgy and Greek philosophy, particularly in the melting pot of Alexandria. Imagine scholars, scribes, and mystics gathering in a city where libraries hummed like temples and everyone spoke at least 3 languages, usually badly. Ideas mixed like acids in a flask. Fire met thought. And out came a worldview where matter had meaning. The alchemists believed that metal had life stages, just like you. Lead was infancy imperfect, heavy, full of unrealized promise. Silver adulthood, shiny, useful, stable. But gold was the sage, the philosopher, the saint. So you weren't just transforming metal, you were guiding it on a spiritual journey. You lean over a cluttered desk and pick up a dried-out ink pen. Next to it, a wax-sealed letter that reads, "To be opened only when the moon is in Scorpio." which is a very specific male policy. A chart on the wall shows the moon phases and their connections to various stages of the great work. You learn that no one attempted transmutations under a waning crescent. That's when failures happen. Explosions, leaks, broken glass, and broken dreams. Alchemy was part science, part superstition, and part, let's be honest, performance art. The right robes, the right time of day, the right prayers. One foot in the lab, the other in a cathedral. The line between chemical reaction and religious experience was intentionally blurry. Here's a delightful fringe fact. Many alchemists used astrological talismans to stabilize their mixtures. Some even claimed that wearing a sapphire ring or sleeping next to a certain herb could enhance the purity of your gold. Modern chemists might laugh at that, but have they ever tried transmuting matter while wearing a linen robe and fasting on Thursdays? Exactly. You wipe a streak of soot from your cheek and glance at the furnace. The heat has died down, but the lead inside still glows faintly, as if remembering something it's not yet ready to become. You ask yourself again, why lead historians still debate the symbolic choices? Why not copper? Why not tin? But lead had mythic weight. It was Saturn's metal old slow cold and melancholy. The perfect candidate for transformation. Because what's more beautiful than turning sorrow into gold? And it's not just the metal. You begin to suspect the alchemist himself is trying to change. Every hour spent in meditation over a bubbling flask, every page scrawled with impossible symbols, every failure logged in trembling handwriting, it's all part of a personal process. You step back from the bench and realize this isn't a lab. It's a temple. The tools are sacred. The lead is sacrament. The transformation slow and painful as worship. A breeze moves through the room. Not a real one, just a shift. A moment where the air feels lighter, the silence less heavy. And in that moment, you understand something. Alchemy was never just about what's in the flask. It was about what's missing from the world. The hunger for meaning, for order, for something eternal in a universe that rusts. And so they chased gold, not to be rich, but to make sense of the dark. You feel the bricks warm against your back as you lean into the stone wall of the alchemist's chamber. Somewhere nearby, something hisses, maybe steam, maybe something more metaphysical. On the table, the lead still sits, like it always has, mute gray, unmoved. But your mind is already wandering. Because to understand why they believed in turning lead into gold, you have to go further back. You have to go to ancient Egypt. You shut your eyes, and when you open them again, the walls are no longer made of medieval stone. They are carved in hieroglyphs. The scent of incense replaces that of sulfur. And outside, instead of snow, there's sand, the kind that whispers between pyramid stones and carries secrets up the Nile. You're standing in Alexandria, not the modern city, but the ancient one. A crossroads of culture. Greek, Egyptian, Persian, Jewish, even early Roman ideas, all mingling in the air, like different metals in a crucible. And here, alchemy isn't a fringe pursuit. It's something sacred, something state-sponsored, something that walks hand in hand with God's. They didn't call it alchemy, not yet. They called it chemia, rooted in the Egyptian word for the black, fertile soil of the Nile chem. The idea that something could be grown transformed, made new. The land itself was a metaphor. You walk through the courtyard of a temple where priests, half scientist, half magician, grind stones under moonlight. They chant over blue glazed jars. They boil herbs. They consult stars. They speak of the metal nedger, the divine infused in gold. Not because gold was pretty, but because gold never tarnished. To the Egyptians, gold wasn't just valuable, it was eternal. Skin of the gods, breath of the sun, a metal that resisted death, decay, and time. The pharaohs were buried with it, not because they were wealthy, but because they hoped it would carry them into the afterlife intact. Historians generally agree that this is one of the earliest seeds of Western alchemical thought, that gold's untarnishable nature gave rise to a symbolic system where physical purity and spiritual purity walked the same path. Turning lead into gold wasn't just metallurgy, it was resurrection. A quirky little tidbit Egyptian goldsmiths sometimes faked it. They created alloys that looked like gold, but weren't just to give the illusion of divinity. Alchemy, before it even had a name, was already blurring the line between reality and belief. You enter the great library, past marble pillars and papyrus scrolls piled high. You hear Greek spoken here, and Coptic, and others you can't place. You see a scholar hunched over an astronomical chart, calculating the motion of Venus as he stirs something viscous in a copper bowl. You wonder if he's trying to find love, or just trying to extract mercury without blowing himself up. This is where alchemy begins to become language, not just matter-changing, but meaning-shifting. Symbols swirl together, earth and water gods, and metals, man and star. It's messy. It's magical. It's everything modern science tried to clean up. But back then, there was no line between chemistry and philosophy. If you asked someone whether they were a scientist or a priest, they might blink at you and say, yes. You stop before a shrine to Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom writing and, yes, alchemy. He holds a stylus and scroll. On his pedestal lies a single golden ring. The inscription, "He who understands the metal understands himself." Scholars still debate whether the Egyptian contribution to alchemy was practical or poetic. Did they really pursue transmutation, or did they just wrap metallurgy in metaphor? Hard to say. Much was lost when the library burned, when scrolls turned to smoke, when centuries of whispered secrets dissolved into legend. But the fire didn't end the belief. It scattered it. Ideas made it to Greece, then Rome, then Byzantium, then into the hands of curious monks and wandering mystics in medieval Europe. You blink, and you're back in the dimly lit chamber. The alchemist is scribbling something with intense focus. You peek over his shoulder, a triangle. Inside it, a cross. Underneath, a serpent eating its tail, the Ouroboros. A symbol as old as Alexandria, maybe older. One word below it, in Latin refictio. I remake. You watch his hand pause. He lifts the pen, and for a moment the room stills. Maybe he doesn't believe he'll live to see lead turn to gold. Maybe he doesn't even believe it's possible. But still, he writes. Because something in him needs to believe. That the world can change. That the base can become noble. That death isn't the end. That from ash gold can still be born. And so he burns the candle, grinds the minerals, waits for the stars to align. Because that's what faith looks like in a lab coat. The candle guttered. The fire hissed. The parchment curled slightly at the edges as the alchemist exhaled a breath that smelled faintly of vinegar and roasted copper. You remain beside him, the air now thick with the scent of singed herbs and stubborn ambition. But tonight, the lead does not shimmer. It does not flake. It simply sits unchanged, unbothered by your expectations. And so your gaze drifts backward in time again. This time to Greece, where thought itself was being melted down and recast philosopher by philosopher. If Egypt gave alchemy its mystery, Greece gave it its language. And the four elements, earth, air, fire, and water, became the building blocks of everything seen and unseen. You find yourself in the company of Empedocles, who first proposed that all matter was made from those four primal forces. You watch him gesture wildly in a stone amphitheater, declaring fire not just an element, but a spirit. He believed in love and strife as cosmic forces binding and separating, just like acids and alkalis. Then comes Aristotle, more organized, less poetic. He refines it 4 elements, but also 4 qualities: hot, cold, wet, dry. Mix them in the right proportions, and any substance can be changed into another. Lead is just a little too cold, too dry. Add the right opposite, and presto, gold. You wonder if that sounded logical back then. You wonder if it still kind of does. Historians agree this was a turning point, a bridge between mystical thinking and what would eventually become natural philosophy. The Greeks didn't melt lead in their temples, but they gave later alchemists the justification to try. Because if the world was made of simple components, and if those components could be rearranged, well, why couldn't you turn lead into gold? Here's your quirky detail: the Greek alchemy wasn't called alchemy yet. The word wouldn't exist for centuries, but the ideas were fermenting, and some of them were wonderfully strange. Like Zosimos of Panopolis, an Egyptian Greek mystic from the 3rd century CE, who wrote about talking spirits trapped in flasks, metals with souls, and transformations that required divine dreams to complete. You imagine him sleeping beside a bubbling retort, hoping for a vision, not of gold, but of insight, of cosmic approval, of that moment when the world turns its head slightly and lets you understand something no one else does. Back in the alchemist's lab, you find a battered copy of a treatise, Greek, translated through Arabic, then Latin, then maybe French, and barely holding together. The diagrams are familiar now: the sun and moon in perpetual dance, the red lion chasing the white eagle. And always that phrase, solve et coagula, dissolve and combine. It's a recipe, but it's also a life philosophy. You start to see the pattern. All this work, hundreds of years of it, wasn't random. It was a slow layering. Egypt laid the foundation. Greece built the logic. And then somewhere between the fall of Rome and the rise of medieval Europe, alchemy caught fire again, this time under an entirely new sky. But before we get there, consider this: the Greeks believed in teleology, that everything had a purpose, a final form it was trying to reach. An acorn becomes a tree. A child becomes a thinker. A base metal becomes gold. So when an alchemist stared into a furnace, they weren't just watching matter. They were watching destiny in slow motion. That's why the work mattered even when it failed. You touch the crucible again. Still warm, still gray, still stubborn. But maybe the transformation isn't supposed to happen yet. Maybe it happens in the waiting. Historians still argue whether these early thinkers truly believed in transformation or just used it as metaphor. Some say it was all allegory. Others argue they believed literally. The texts don't clarify much. They're too busy describing dragons. But maybe the truth is this alchemy never pretended to be simple. It was allowed to be strange. Because the world is strange. Because we are. And that's the magic of it. Not the gold. Not the formulas. But the refusal to accept the ordinary as final. You lean closer to the alchemist's notes. One line stands out, scratched in a moment of tired hope. Nothing is ever just what it seems. And suddenly, you don't mind that the lead didn't change. Because maybe you did. The room smells like failure. Not in a depressing way, more like scorched rosemary and hot iron. The kind of scent that lingers when a plan almost works. The kind of scent that alchemists grow strangely fond of. You reach for a quill, then stop. It's not yours. The desk is still cluttered with scribbled parchments and dried herbs. The furnace has gone quiet for now, its mouth dark and cool. you realize the alchemist is gone, maybe off for more charcoal. Or maybe off chasing a dream that only makes sense by moonlight. So you wander. You lift a cracked clay vial labeled with curling Arabic script. You don't read the language, but the shape of the letters alone feels like magic. And that's not far off. Because while Europe fumbled in feudal chaos, it was the Islamic Golden Age that preserved and expanded alchemy's fragile flame. You find yourself in Baghdad sometime around the 9th century, and everything smells of ink and jasmine and fresh parchment. You walk through the great house of wisdom, where scholars debate the movement of stars and the boiling point of mercury with equal enthusiasm. Books are copied, translated, expanded. And in the middle of it all, Jabir ibn Hayyan. He's the name that comes up again and again in these scrolls. Latinized as Geber, his reputation is half genius, half legend. They say he wrote hundreds of treatises, some practical, some mystical, some, let's be honest, probably ghost-written centuries later. But his ideas took root. He believed that everything in the world was made from combinations of sulfur and mercury, not the literal substances, but symbolic ones. Sulfur, hot, active masculine. Mercury, cool, passive feminine. Combine them just right, and maybe, just maybe, you get gold. Or enlightenment. Or both. Historians widely credit the Islamic world with transforming alchemy from philosophical poetry into something more systematic. They introduced laboratory tools. They recorded procedures. They refined substances. They argued about ratios. And crucially, they believed that transformation wasn't just physical, it was moral. Alchemy was about purifying the soul, elevating the mind, and understanding God's architecture through the lens of material change. It was science and devotion at once. Here's a delightful fringe detail. Some alchemists claimed their recipes would only work if performed with the right intent. That impure motives, greed, laziness, arrogance, would literally cause the mixture to fail. Can you imagine a Bunsen burner judging your character before agreeing to ignite? Back in the lab, you turn a page and find a series of elegant diagrams. One shows a tree with metals hanging from its branches like fruit. Lead near the roots, silver in the middle, gold at the very top. At the base of the tree, a tiny human figure kneels. He's praying, not picking. You remember now that alchemy was in many places closely tied to religion. It wasn't heretical, it was seen as another way of seeking truth. The divine order wasn't just preached from pulpits. It was studied through flasks and flames. You pick up a lump of cinnabar, a bright red mineral mercury sulfide. It glows faintly in the dim light. Toxic, yes, but essential, a staple in many transmutation experiments. The alchemists believed it was one of the raw voices of the earth, a material humming with potential. You hold it carefully, respectfully. It's dangerous, but also beautiful. Outside the window, the moon rises. You remember Jabir's belief that metals were not static things, but processes. That lead could become gold. That humans could become more than what they seemed. Modern scientists roll their eyes at this. After all, they argue lead doesn't want anything. It's just an element. But you're starting to suspect that the alchemists weren't talking to elements. They were talking to themselves. They believed that by studying the most stubborn materials, they could learn to change. Not just matter, but mindset, perspective, spirit. You run your hand along the spine of a leather-bound volume titled Kitab al-Habib, the Book of the Beloved. No one's quite sure what it contains. Some say it's a metaphorical guide to union with God. Others think it's just a very poetic lab manual. You suspect it's both. Historians still argue whether Jabir was one man or a school of thought, whether his works were visionary or derivative, whether his emphasis on balance and proportion came from Greek logic or something deeper. But no one denies his influence. Without the Islamic preservation and innovation of alchemy, the European Renaissance might never have happened. And speaking of Europe, you glance back at the crucible. The lead is still lead. But somehow it feels closer, not warmer, not shinier, just closer. Because tonight, you understand a little more. Alchemy was never a straight line. It was a winding road lit by faith and flame. And even when the mixture failed, even when the metals didn't glow, the alchemists kept going. Not because they were sure it would work, but because they knew the attempt was sacred. The room flickers as the candle strains against the growing dark. The lead still sits silent and unmoved, but something around it feels more alive now. Like every failure in this chamber has settled into the mortar of the walls and decided, well, at least we're part of the story. You lean back in the rickety chair, watching the flame curl and sway. It reminds you of something, a flicker of memory that drags you across centuries and into the vaulted catacombs of a European monastery. Welcome to the Middle Ages. No longer Alexandria, no longer Baghdad. This time you're underground. Damp stone presses inward. Shelves sag with parchment and powder. But make no mistake, this isn't some dungeon for the damned. This is where Europe's alchemical revival begins. You hear soft footsteps and quiet prayers. A monk in a simple wool robe steps carefully between barrels of ash and glass flasks. He bows not before a crucifix, but before a distillation coil. To him, they're not so different. You're in the basement of a Benedictine monastery, perhaps, or tucked in the cellars of a Cistercian abbey. Wherever it is, the monks here are doing more than copying scripture. They're experimenting. Quietly, carefully, desperately. Historians point out that monasteries were among the few places in medieval Europe where literacy, access to ancient texts, and time all converged. Many monks studied Jabir's writings, passed through Arabic into Latin, often mangled in translation, but still potent in inspiration. You peer over the monk's shoulder. He's heating something in a small copper vessel, wine, most likely. But this isn't for drinking. This is for distillation. He wants to extract its spirit, its essence. And in doing so, he's learning more than chemistry. He's learning how the world hides meaning inside matter. A tiny puff of steam escapes the coil. It's not gold, no. But to him, it's holy. And here's the quirky detail for many monks. Alcohol, yes, alcohol was considered a kind of spiritual revelation. They called it aqua vitae, the water of life. It wasn't just medicine, it was a metaphor. Liquid that transformed the mind. Fire in fluid form. You smile. Maybe they weren't that far off. But the monks didn't just want to get tipsy. They were after something deeper. Some believed that purifying matter was a kind of prayer through action, that heating and refining could lead to insight, just like fasting or silence. And yes, some whispered of the philosopher's stone. You've heard of it, haven't you? The legendary substance that could transmute base metals into gold. That could heal any illness, extend life, even grant immortality. Part relic, part metaphor, part cosmic inside joke, it was the holy grail of alchemy. In the monk's notebook, you find a sketch. A red sphere surrounded by rays of light. Beneath it, a phrase in Latin, veritas occultatur, truth, is hidden. You ask yourself, did they believe in the stone as a physical object? Something hidden in a cave, buried in a scroll? Or was it always meant to be inward? Historians still argue this point. Some alchemists insisted it was real, that they'd seen it, maybe even held it. Others described it only in symbols, a green lion devouring the sun, a king and queen merging in a glass coffin. Images that could mean anything or nothing. But the search mattered. The process, the belief. and that belief spread. You shift scenes now from the monastery to the dusty corners of a medieval apothecary, where alchemy drifts into the lives of ordinary people. The elixir of life is being sold in little bottles, probably cut with honey and superstition. Lead filings soaked in vinegar are peddled as love potions. Street alchemists promise to double your silver for the price of a chicken and an oath. Not all of them believe, but many do. Because even then, alchemy wasn't just about science or symbols. It was about hope in a world full of plagues, famines, and relentless uncertainty. The candle flickers again. You're back in the present, or something like it. The lab still hums faintly with centuries of echoes. The crucible still waits. The alchemist, wherever he's gone, left his tools arranged just so. And on the windowsill, a tiny sprig of rosemary has taken root in a cracked clay cup. No one watered it. No one planned it. But still it grows, and maybe that's what alchemy really was. A quiet, persistent belief that with enough patience, enough fire, and enough focus, even lead could become something more. You glance at the lead again. It hasn't changed. Still heavy, still gray, still stubborn. But tonight, the candlelight hits it differently. For just a moment, it almost glows. You reach out to touch it, and a thought slides into your mind, smooth, uninvited, and ancient. The philosopher's stone isn't what you think. You look around the room. The scrolls, the symbols, the broken glass, the ash that never quite gets swept away. And you realize something this whole time you've been assuming the alchemists wanted gold. What if they didn't? What if they wanted meaning? You close your eyes, and the room shifts again. Not physically, alchemists weren't in the business of teleportation, but through imagination, memory, and metaphor. You find yourself in a modest stone workshop in 15th century Prague. The walls are covered in star maps. There's a string of garlic over the door and 3 different cats that definitely aren't just pets. The man at the bench is gaunt, glassy-eyed, and humming a hymn no one has sung in centuries. He's trying to find the stone, not because he's greedy, because he's desperate. To cure something, to finish something, to redeem something. The philosopher's stone, despite the pop culture versions, isn't some sparkly jewel. It's not even really a stone. The Latin lapis philosophorum could just as easily be translated as the thing the wise seek. And isn't that more interesting? Some alchemists described it as red powder, capable of transforming base metals into gold. Others said it was liquid light, an essence that could heal anything. And then there were those who whispered that it wasn't a substance at all. It was a state of being. Historians still debate which camp was more influential. Was it physical, symbolic, allegorical? Maybe all 3. The point wasn't just to make gold. It was to become something gold-like, incorruptible, balanced, eternal. A quirky idea from the 16th century, some alchemists claimed that the philosopher's stone worked only when the user was morally worthy, that a corrupt heart would render it inert, that no amount of knowledge could substitute for virtue. Imagine that. A world where purity of spirit was part of the recipe. You watch the Prague alchemist crush rose petals into a red powder. He mixes them with mercury, whispers something over the bowl, and places the mixture beneath a copper dome. He lights a flame beneath it, waits. It hisses, steams, boils. It explodes. He doesn't flinch, because this is his 20th failure today. You admire him. Not for his results, he hasn't had any, but for his faith. The belief that if he just tries one more time, the world will finally make sense. That imperfection can be corrected. You blink and you're back in the present-day lab. The lead sits. The air is heavy with stillness. On the wall hangs a crude drawing of a snake eating its own tail, the Ouroboros, a symbol of eternal return, of cycles, of things that seem like endings, but aren't. You ask yourself, what if the stone was never meant to be found? What if it was the act of searching that made you worthy? What if turning lead into gold was just the metaphor we needed to explain? The harder truth that transformation starts inside. That lead becomes gold when you change. The Alchemist's journal sits open on the desk. You skim through the pages. One entry catches your eye. Today I failed again. And today I was closer. It doesn't say why. Doesn't say how. But somehow you believe him. The philosopher's stone might not exist as a thing you can hold. But maybe it exists as a direction, a commitment, a reason to try again. You pick up the lead. It's just as heavy as before. But now you hold it differently. Not like something to conquer, but like something to care for. Maybe this is what they meant all along. That the real transmutation, the one no fire can fake, is the shift from seeking power to seeking purpose. And when you understand that the lead doesn't have to become gold, because maybe it already has. You still hold the lead, but your hand rests now, not gripping, not hoping, just holding. It's quiet in the chamber. No flames, no formulas. Just the sound of your breath and the soft creak of wooden beams overhead. Then a sound breaks the stillness. A whisper. But not from the walls, from language itself. You're no longer in a workshop, not exactly. You're in a room filled with books, not Latin, not Arabic, but Hebrew. Scrolls lined in gold ink, candles guttering beside carved menorahs. And seated at a low table, ink-stained and murmuring, is a man dressed in a scholar's robe. He is not an alchemist. He is a Kabbalist. And yet, what he's doing, tracing letters through candlelight, searching for the secret names of God, isn't so different. Because he too is trying to transform something. You sit beside him in the flicker glow and glance at the page. Hebrew letters swirl in geometric spirals. You don't read the language, but even without knowing it, you sense there's weight in these words. Each character isn't just a sound, it's a vibration, a code, a thread, that when woven with others, might unlock something more. Some Kabbalists believe that language wasn't invented, it was received. That the Hebrew alphabet existed before the world did. That when God spoke, he used these shapes. And if you knew how to arrange them, you could rearrange reality. Sound familiar? Historians still explore the connection between Jewish mysticism and alchemy. They overlapped in certain periods, especially in medieval Spain and parts of the Islamic world. Both systems sought hidden truths. Both were obsessed with structure. And both used symbols that required a lifetime to even partially decode. A quirky overlap. Some Kabbalists believe the human body mirrored the tree of life, the same way alchemists believe the body mirrored the stars. 10 sephirot for divine attributes, 7 classical planets for metals. Alchemy spoke through matter. Kabbalah spoke through metaphor. But both whispered the same thing: the divine is hidden in plain sight. You watch the scholar draw 3 letters in a row. He doesn't say them aloud, but you sense their weight. He pauses, then speaks Yod, He, Vav, He, the unspoken name of God. You don't hear thunder, you don't see light. But something in the air changes, not violently, just gently, like a curtain pulled slightly aside. He turns to you and says softly, "To know the name of something is to know its essence." You think of the alchemist, of the lead, of the scribbled margins and the desperate attempts to name the process. Maybe this is why so many alchemists wrote in code not to hide their secrets from others, but to avoid saying aloud things that couldn't be captured with words. In this room, lead becomes not a metal, but a syllable. Gold becomes not currency, but clarity. The transmutation is linguistic, ritualistic, almost prayerful. You glance at the scholar again. He's not trying to get rich. He's not mixing chemicals. But he is, in his own way, trying to turn the mundane into the divine. And that, too, is alchemy. Back in the lab, the candle sputters. The scent of beeswax returns. You look down at the lead just metal. But now it feels like a letter. Part of a word you haven't finished writing. Maybe alchemy didn't fail. Maybe it just evolved into poetry, into language, into quiet systems of understanding. Historians still argue whether mystical traditions like Kabbalah influenced practical alchemy or simply ran alongside it, sharing metaphors without methods. But you no longer care about distinctions. You care about the impulse to understand, to name, to speak transformation into being, even if the only person who hears you is yourself. And maybe that's the real magic. Not that the name turns lead into gold, but that it turns your longing into direction. You place the lead back on the table not like a tool, but like a syllable. Part of a sentence you're still writing. One that begins, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word became light." The lead sits quietly where you left it, ordinary, unmoving, unchanged. But your eyes have changed. You step away from the table and move toward the window, the ancient glass warped and bubbled like thoughts too long in the mind. Outside, the night is still. The moon casts just enough light to blur the line between real and imagined. Behind you, a flask lets off a lazy puff of steam. The alchemist is still gone. Or perhaps you've become him. It's hard to tell anymore. The air stirs, and suddenly you're somewhere else again. Not in a monastery, not in Alexandria, but somewhere more personal. A room without wall, a memory, a mood. There's the smell of burning charcoal, a flick of orange from a nearby fire, and in your hands, a mortar and pestle. Inside it, something bright red cinnabar, maybe, or a berry, or powdered rust. It doesn't matter. You grind, you mix, and you hope. This is what alchemy often looked like, not grand libraries and royal laboratories, but improvised corners of smoky rooms. People hunched over coals, muttering prayers under their breath, while their neighbors outside bartered over bread. Because alchemy wasn't always elite. It wasn't always cloaked in Latin and gold leaf. Sometimes it was kitchen chemistry performed by people who didn't write books, but still dared to believe that matter could change. You see a woman pouring something thick and black into a copper basin. She hums as she stirs. Around her hang bundles of herbs, dried and rustling in the breeze. She doesn't call herself an alchemist, but she speaks the language. She knows when the moon is right. She understands patience. She understands that transformation is rarely loud. Historians call these figures folk alchemists, hedge witches, or cunning folk. They existed on the edges geographically, socially, spiritually. And while they weren't always welcomed by scholars or the church, they carried their own tradition of transmutation. A quirky fact in rural villages from Poland to the Pyrenees, it wasn't uncommon for healers to claim they could influence metal. Some claimed to soften iron with oil and breath. Others swore they could extract golden essence from plants. Whether it worked or not was beside the point. They believed it might, and that belief shaped their world. You watch as the woman lifts the ladle. The mixture shimmers faintly in the firelight. Not gold, not yet, but beautiful in its own rough way. She pours it into a clay mold and wraps it in cloth, then places it gently in the coals. And then she waits. You think about how often that word comes up in alchemy. Wait, watch, breathe, try again. Back in the alchemist's chamber, the candle is almost gone. A trail of wax drips over the table like a frozen waterfall. You reach for the lead again, not out of urgency, but out of familiarity. It's been with you for a while now, maybe longer than you realized. You remember now not all alchemists wrote books. Not all wore robes. Some just carried a question in their pocket and kept stirring. Historians still argue whether these local small-scale alchemists were truly part of the alchemical tradition. But you start to see that the line is blurry. The ambition was the same. Take something base, transform it, and maybe transform yourself in the process. You place the lead back on the shelf, not in frustration, not in surrender, just respectfully. Like you would place a book after reading a chapter that left you thinking. The room feels warm now, even though the fire is out. And you realize you've been chasing gold. But gold isn't a metal, it's a moment. A shimmer in the dark, a breath you didn't expect to feel so deeply. A stillness that somehow says you've moved forward. So tonight the experiment doesn't end with a flash or a formula. It ends with a small, silent truth. Even if the world doesn't change, you can. And that might be the most valuable element of all. You awaken though you hadn't realized you drifted. The lab around you feels both familiar and strange. The shadows have shifted again. The candle has gone out entirely, but something unseen now lights the space. Not flame, not sun, just clarity. You rub your eyes, stretch your fingers, and glance toward the far wall where the bricks are damp with the breath of centuries. And then footsteps, soft ones, robed, careful. The alchemist has returned. But he's not what you expected. No wild hair, no glittering vial of gold. He's a monk, perhaps, or just a man who looks like he's had more failures than meals. His eyes are gentle if a little haunted, and his hands covered in ink, not gold dust. He nods at you, but says nothing. He walks to a small cabinet and removes a worn book bound in leather and faith. The title has been lost to time. You can barely make out the embossed emblem on the cover, a serpent, a sun, and the outline of a chalice. He opens it. You follow. Inside, carefully pressed between its pages, is a flower. Wilted, crumbling, but unmistakably lavender. And this is when you learn that alchemy wasn't always metal and fire. Sometimes it was aroma, distillation, essence. You blink and suddenly you're elsewhere again. Not in a monastery, not in a royal lab, but in a quiet garden behind cloistered walls. Rows of herbs stretch in the sunlight, rosemary, mint, sage, and yes, lavender. You walk past a young apprentice, head-shaved hands, dirty nose deep in a blossom. He isn't studying gold. He's studying scent. Because here alchemy is practiced in the still room, the monastery's place for oils, tinctures, and the gentle extraction of invisible truths. Distillation is the name of the game. Heat a liquid, capture its vapor, and condense it again. What you get isn't gold, but something purer. The soul of a plant, its invisible voice. A quirky detail from the medieval period. Many believed lavender could calm a restless spirit, not just emotionally, but spiritually. That its essence could purify not only rooms, but hearts. To alchemists of the softer sort, this wasn't superstition. It was refinement, a way of unlocking the divine trapped in nature. Back in the lab, the alchemist gently lifts the pressed lavender and places it in a small clay bowl. He adds a few drops of water from a ceramic jug. Then, with surprising reverence, he sets the bowl near the lead. You ask why. He smiles tiredly and says, "Not everything must burn to change." You sit with that, because maybe the fire isn't always literal. Maybe transformation comes softly, through patience, through care, through moments of stillness that evaporate into understanding. Historians often overlook this branch of alchemy, the botanical, the herbal, the fragrant. It lacked the spectacle of transmutation, the glamour of golden promises. But it was no less sacred. In fact, some argue it was more honest. You watch the steam curl from the bowl of lavender water. It catches the moonlight. It looks like something you could almost touch, and yet, the moment you try it, vanishes. You think of the alchemists who worked their entire lives not in pursuit of glory, but of purification. Not to change the world, but to understand it. Not to be powerful, but to be in harmony. And suddenly the lead makes sense again. Not as failure, not as challenge, but as witness to the endless, tireless work of becoming. You look down at your own hands, smudged, tired, not golden, and yet a little lighter. You whisper mostly to yourself, maybe I am the vessel. Maybe I am the flame. And for once the lead doesn't answer, because it doesn't have to. It's already taught you enough. You don't remember falling asleep. But when you stir again, the lab is exactly as you left it. The lavender water has cooled. The lead remains lead. The alchemist is gone once more, perhaps upstairs, perhaps centuries away. But in the stillness, you feel something lingering. A question. A deeper hum. What if turning lead into gold was never really about the lead? What if it was always about you? You rise from your seat and find yourself facing a worn, creaking door tucked behind a bookshelf. You press your hand to it, and it opens. Beyond lies a narrow hallway, walls lined not with shelves, but mirrors. Warped, smoky, ancient. Each reflection slightly off. Taller, shorter, older, younger. You walk slowly, and as you pass each mirror, you see versions of yourself, not yet born, or long-forgotten faces of someone changing. The hallway leads to a round chamber with a domed ceiling. Above, a painted fresco of stars and serpents and suns swirling in impossible harmony. In the center of the floor, a basin carved from black stone. Inside the basin, no gold, just water. And a single ordinary human face staring back. Yours. You sit on the edge, and your memory drifts again, this time to words written by countless alchemists over the centuries. Phrases you've seen in Latin, Greek, Arabic, Hebrew, etched into copper or scribbled in soot. Visita interiora terrae, rectificando invenies occultum lapidem. Visit the interior of the earth, and by rectifying it, you will find the hidden stone. But what if earth didn't mean dirt? What if it meant you? Historians call this the spiritual alchemy, a tradition that views the great work not as a physical process, but as a journey of the soul. The metals are metaphors. The lead is your fear, your shame, your smallness. The gold is wisdom balance, compassion, things you don't buy but become. You return now to the lab, not physically, but inwardly. The lead is on the table. You touch it. You think of the countless times it refused to change. You think of the fire you fed it, the prayers you whispered, the formulas you memorized. And then you realize maybe the goal wasn't to make it gold. Maybe the goal was to not give up trying. A curious aside. Some alchemists wrote that the philosopher's stone was transparent, weightless, tasteless, and without price. In other words, nothing you could hold. Yet they believed in it with a clarity that feels almost contagious. You glance at your hands again. They are the same, but not quite. There's something quieter in them now, something steadier. The alchemist's journal sits open on the desk. You read the next page. To transmute the soul is harder than metal, but unlike gold, it will not vanish with time. You close the book softly, and for the first time, you stop asking whether the lead will change. Instead, you wonder how much you already have. You glance around at the instruments, the flasks, the crumbling paper. They're no longer tools of ambition. They're witnesses. They've seen centuries of hope, failure, joy, despair, and still they remain. That's when it strikes you. Alchemy is not the search for wealth. It is the refusal to abandon the possibility of transformation. Even when the world tells you it's impossible. Even when nothing seems to shine. Even when you're holding something as dull and unyielding as a lump of lead. Especially then. You take a deep breath, and for the first time in a long while, you don't need the lead to change. You just need to keep going. You sit back, letting your body ease into the creaky chair again. The wood groans beneath your weight, as if it too has been on a long journey. You've followed the lead down every rabbit hole, through temples and monasteries, gardens and scrolls, stars and dreams. But now you feel yourself drifting into yet another room, one louder, brighter, full of laughter and suspicion in equal measure. Welcome to the courts of Renaissance Europe. This time, alchemy isn't a private pursuit or a monk's whisper. It's a performance staged in palaces, sold to kings, and often backed by gold that hasn't been conjured yet. You find yourself in the grand salon of a noble house. Tapestries line the walls. A greyhound sleeps beneath a table piled with silver goblets. Candles burn low, and beside the hearth stands a man in a velvet doublet gesturing grandly to a crowd of courtiers. He is an alchemist, or at least he plays one very well. A tray of metals sits before him. He lifts a flask, pours something fuming and iridescent, and with a theatrical flare, poof, a puff of smoke. Something that glints gold. The audience gasps. The Duke leans forward. Someone claps. Someone else looks very, very skeptical. Because by now, alchemy has become both science and scam. A quirky historical fact, the 16th and 17th centuries were full of charlatans posing as alchemists. Some carried hollow rods stuffed with pre-hidden gold. Others used sleight of hand or tinctures that temporarily colored metals. One man famously escaped imprisonment by claiming he was 1 week away from the final stage. He just needed a little more funding. Sound familiar? Historians have uncovered countless tales of kings and nobles funding alchemists in hopes of eternal youth, endless gold, or immortality. Most of them were disappointed. Some were poisoned. A few, fascinatingly, became believers anyway. Because deep down, they didn't want proof. They wanted hope. You move quietly past the crowd in the salon and into a back room. It's quieter here, a bit of a mess. And at a desk beneath a window, you see another man, an alchemist too, but not dressed for theater. His sleeves are rolled, his fingers stained. He's writing not for applause, but for understanding. He's real, and he's exhausted. Because this is what most alchemy looked like in those centuries, not flash and fire, but years of obsessive notebooks, broken glassware, dangerous chemicals, and uncertain outcomes. Lead, failure, repeat. You lean over his shoulder. On the page is a diagram, a familiar one now. Circles, triangles, suns. And next to it, a phrase, "The fool seeks gold. The wise seek understanding." You smile. Because even here, where alchemy is being sold like miracle oil, there are still people searching honestly. You think of John Dee, the astrologer and alchemist, who advised Queen Elizabeth I. He believed alchemy was divine work, part mathematics, part mysticism. He spent years talking to angels through a crystal with a colleague who may or may not have been translating actual celestial language. Historians still debate whether Dee was a genius, a madman, or just lonely. Maybe all three. But he left behind books filled with visions and symbols, fragments of a mind still trying to find the hidden order. You also remember Edward Kelly Dee's companion, a man with a flair for drama and a reputation for deception. He claimed he could produce gold through alchemy. He gained fame, then prison, then, depending on the version you read, either a broken leg or a broken neck. Because when you promise gold and fail to deliver quartz, get cranky. The alchemist beside you sighs. He dips his pen again, scratches another line, and you realize there were always two kinds of alchemists: those who performed it and those who lived it. Back in the present, your own lab feels quieter, more honest. The lead still lead reflects a sliver of moonlight. It almost looks like silver now, not gold, but still shining. And you think maybe the truest alchemy is resisting the need to impress. Maybe it's continuing the work even when no one claps. Historians often frame this era as the beginning of alchemy's decline, its slow descent into fraud fantasy and disrepute. But that's not quite right. It didn't die. It changed clothes. It hid deeper. The charlatans took center stage. But in quiet rooms, real work continued, like yours. So tonight the crucible doesn't boil. The crowd doesn't cheer. The gold doesn't appear. And still you write. Still you try. Because deep down you know some things are more valuable than gold. Like truth, like discipline, like the refusal to lie to yourself about what matters. You close the notebook, not the work, just the page, and prepare once again to begin. The curtain is pulled back again just slightly, and you feel the shift in the air before you see it. No more courts, no monks, no incense. You are in a plain wooden room, cold, drafty, barely lit. The only sound is the scratching of a quill and the occasional cough from a man hunched over a small writing desk. The candlelight catches his face just enough for you to see it, stern, brilliant, and completely absorbed. You're looking at Isaac Newton. Yes, that Newton. The man who gave us gravity calculus and the laws of motion, the rational titan of the Enlightenment. But here, in this flickering silence, he is not writing equations. He is writing alchemical recipes. You blink. Historians long suspected Newton dabbled in alchemy. But when they finally examined his private notebooks, some of which were auctioned off centuries later, they discovered he didn't just dabble. He was obsessed. For every page he wrote about motion or optics, there were pages more filled with alchemical experiments, cryptic symbols, and searches for the philosopher's stone. You watch him stir a mixture of mercury and lead, muttering to himself about purification. The same man who explained tides and telescopes is now consulting texts with titles like The Secrets of Alchemists and Clavis Philosophiae. And here's a quirky detail. Newton believed in something called the Green Lion, a symbolic figure in alchemy said to devour the sun and produce gold. He referenced it repeatedly, trying to decode its meaning. Was it a metaphor, a real substance, an allegory for sulfuric acid? No one's sure. Even Newton wasn't sure. Because he wasn't chasing certainty, he was chasing transcendence. You peek over his shoulder and see a passage he's translating something from a 17th century mystic. It mentions divine fire, celestial dew, and a purification that begins not with metal, but with the self. It all feels very far from modern science. And yet Newton never saw a contradiction. To him, alchemy and science were the same path, just different legs of the journey. Historians still argue over how deeply Newton believed. Did he think he could really create gold? Or was he more interested in alchemy's symbolic system, a key to understanding the mind of God? Either way, he kept the work secret. He knew his peers wouldn't understand. He also knew perhaps better than anyone that not all truth wears a lab coat. Back in the present, your lab feels a little smaller, but not lesser. Because if Newton could spend his nights decoding cryptic symbols in search of something higher, maybe your own search isn't so foolish after all. You think of all the scientists who started as alchemists or were influenced by them. Robert Boyle, who refined the experimental method, but still believed in transmutation. Paracelsus, who pushed for medicine based on observation, but also claimed to create homunculi, tiny artificial beings. Helena Blavatsky, centuries later, who tried to blend mysticism and chemistry in theosophical texts. Alchemy didn't vanish. It shaped modern science. It evolved. The lab becomes a little brighter, not from fire, but from understanding. You pick up Newton's old pen just for a moment. It's heavier than it looks. And you realize the search for transformation isn't irrational. It's what science and spirituality have always had in common. The belief that the universe can be understood if only you're willing to look closely enough. You return to the crucible. You do not expect gold, but you do expect meaning. And maybe that's even harder to forge. You press your palm to the table and say aloud this time, "Let the work continue." Not because you need to prove anything, but because you finally understand to refine the world. You must first refine how you see it. And that begins not with a medal, but with you. You stay at the table long after the echoes of Newton's presence fade. The candle is gone now, reduced to a stub of wax like a forgotten metaphor. The lead sits untouched. The room is dark quiet and full of something heavier than silence anticipation. You lean into it. You listen, because the next chapter doesn't start with a bang. It starts with a whisper. You find yourself drifting again, not through centuries, but through symbols, through the very heart of the alchemical language. Those swirling diagrams, strange beast suns with human faces, kings and queens merging into golden children, it's all there waiting to be read. But reading isn't enough. You must feel them. You step into a manuscript, yes, into it. The parchment folds around you like a dome of dreams. The ink shines with age and meaning. And everywhere you turn, there's something odd and beautiful and baffling. A lion eating the sun. A man emerging from a tomb holding 2 flasks. A red king and a white queen kissing beneath a 7-pointed star. What does it all mean? You touch the lion. Its mane ripples beneath your fingers like heat. You ask it quietly, "Are you sulfur?" It says nothing. It just burns a little brighter. Alchemy wasn't just chemistry or mysticism. It was art, an entire symbolic ecosystem that conveyed truths too slippery for plain language. Historians call this the allegorical tradition. Alchemists rarely wrote in direct terms. They layered their texts with symbols, metaphors, and codes, not just to protect their secrets, but because truth itself was layered. One quirky bit. There's an entire alchemical diagram known as the Azoth of the philosophers, a single image meant to encapsulate the entire process of transformation, from ignorance to enlightenment. It's like someone tried to cram a novel of prayer and a lab manual into one medieval poster. And somehow, it works. You step past a tree with golden fruit. One apple falls into your palm. It turns to dust. You're not sad. That's just what truth does sometimes. It arrives. It breaks apart. And then you understand it differently. You walk deeper into the manuscript. At the center is a figure made of both sun and moon, a being of balance, of opposites reconciled. It doesn't speak, but you hear something anyway. Gold is not the opposite of lead. It is its fulfillment. Back in the lab, you wake though you were never quite asleep. You realize now why the symbols were so strange. Because transformation itself is strange. It doesn't move in straight lines. It loops, spirals, repeats. It demands patience and failure and a willingness to feel foolish again and again. You think of how many alchemists spent their lives decoding other alchemists. Of how many diagrams were copied without fully understanding them, just a faithful recreation of someone else's faith. And still the tradition grew, not through gold, but through storytelling. It's the part most people forget. Alchemy wasn't just passed down in formulas. It was passed down in metaphors, myths, images. The diagrams weren't distractions. They were invitations to wonder, to interpret, to try. You turn to your own notebook, and for the first time in this long journey you draw. Not a formula, not a measurement, just a circle. Inside it, a triangle. Inside that, a square. And in the center, a dot. You don't need to explain it. You just need to look at it. It says what words can't. That the path from lead to gold isn't walked in a line, it's danced through a spiral. And you're still dancing. You close the notebook, not to end the work, but to rest. Because tomorrow you'll open it again, and the symbols will still be there. Waiting, the symbols linger behind your eyes long after you've shut the notebook. You blink and still the triangle within the circle remains. Not just an image now, but a kind of inner compass. A way of seeing. You stretch your fingers, rub the ink from your palms, and reach once again for the lead. It's almost comforting now, its weight familiar, its silence less intimidating. And then quietly you wonder, why lead, why gold, why not truth? You rise and move toward the furnace. It's cold tonight, untouched for hours. You hesitate, then kneel to stoke it. The coals are shy, but forgiving. With a few gentle breaths, the fire returns slowly, softly. You place the lead on a small crucible plate and slide it into the heat. Not with expectation, just with attention. Because you've come to understand, alchemy is not about commanding matter. It's about listening to it. You glance around the lab, suddenly aware of how much it resembles a mind. Scrolls, core memory. Flasks, emotion. The furnace, the heart maybe. Or the ego. And the lead, the questions you haven't answered yet. You lean against the workbench and think back to how all of this began, not with gold, not even with transformation, but with yearning. That ever-present, ever-human desire to reach beyond yourself. That's what all of this is, really. The labs, the prayers, the symbols, the endless nights of repetition. Alchemy is the practice of radical hope. You recall a fragment from the Emerald Tablet, often attributed to Hermes Trismegistus. It is true without falsehood, certain and most true. That which is below is like that which is above, and that which is above is like that which is below. Historians still argue whether the Emerald Tablet was originally Egyptian Arabic or Greek, whether it was meant to be literal, symbolic, or both. But no one argues its power, because within those few lines is the entire dream of alchemy, that the world is connected, that matter reflects meaning, that transformation is universal. A quirky detail. In some Renaissance versions of the tablet, the text ends not with wisdom, but with an instruction to separate the earth from the fire, the subtle from the gross, with great skill and care. Not destroy, not conquer, just separate. Gently, thoughtfully, That's what you're doing now. Separating yourself from your assumptions, from your impatience, from the illusion that gold is always yellow and shiny. The fire crackles. You check the crucible. No transformation. Not yet. But something in you whispers, it's happening anyway. Because now you look at the lead and don't see failure. You see beginning. Back at the desk, you find a forgotten scrap of parchment tucked into the spine of a heavy book. It reads, "The stone is not found by searching. It is found when you are ready to be still." You place the note in your pocket not for knowledge, but for comfort. Because the process isn't linear. It doesn't reward rushing. It rewards witnessing. And tonight, you are a witness. To the fire. To the metal. To yourself. You don't ask for gold. You just ask for clarity. And in that asking, something shifts, not outside you, but within. You return to the crucible. The lead is glowing slightly. Maybe it's the heat. Maybe it's your eyes. But you don't touch it. You don't need to. Because tonight, it's not about finishing the great work. It's about knowing that the work is worth doing, even if the gold never comes. The fire hums softly now, as if it's learned to breathe with you. You sit nearby, not working, not planning, just being. The lead inside the crucible glows faintly, not yet transformed, but no longer inert. You watch it through the small opening in the furnace, and in its shimmer, you see something older than science. You see ritual. Because for all the talk of acids and elements, for all the notebooks and formulas, alchemy at its core is a sacred act, a liturgy of heat and hope. You reach for a small glass vial resting beside the furnace. It's filled with something thick and red, almost syrupy. The label, faded but legible, reads simply, Rubido, the final stage. In the color symbolism of alchemy, rubido, the reddening, is the moment of completion, the final transformation, not just of the metal, but of the self. But you're not there yet. To understand rubedo, you have to walk through the previous 3 stages. Nigredo, the blackening. Despair, decomposition, the ego dissolving. Albedo, the whitening. Purification. Clarity, the washing away of falsehood. Citrinitas, the yellowing. Awakening, insight, the first glimmers of integration. Rubido, the reddening. Unity, fulfillment, the union of opposites. You smile. Because yes, alchemy had a psychological model before psychology even existed. Centuries before Jung would write about individuation, the alchemists were already tracing the path of becoming. Historians still debate whether these color stages were literal, symbolic, or both. Some texts suggest they correspond to physical reactions in the crucible. Others insist they describe the alchemist's inner journey. You're starting to think it's always been both. A quirky medieval belief some alchemists wrote that you couldn't reach rubido until your shadow loved your light, that you had to embrace every mistake, every failure, every untransformed part of yourself before the gold could appear. You glance again at the crucible. The lead glows a little more now, its edges softening. It's not gold, not yet, but it's closer. You lean back and look at the tools scattered around you, the tongs, the pestle, the twisted fragments of failed vessels. Each one tells a story, not of success, but of persistence. You think again of Newton, of Jabir, of the monk grinding herbs in the dark, of the woman whispering prayers over lavender and flame. They weren't all looking for gold. They were looking for alignment, for a world where inner and outer could mirror each other, where the stars above matched the longing below, where matter could be taught to sing. And isn't that what you're doing too? Not just working metal, but tuning your own voice. You walk to the shelf and pull down a small book, its cover cracked like dried mud. Inside, someone centuries ago has written in trembling ink, "Do not rush the work. Gold made too fast is ash. But gold made slowly will remember you." You close the book, return to the furnace, and whisper not a spell, not a prayer, just a quiet promise. I'll wait. I'll listen. I'll try again. You know now rubido isn't the goal. It's the gift that comes when you've stopped demanding results. When you've passed through black and white and yellow and find yourself still here, still curious, still trying. And when that moment comes, when transformation arrives, it doesn't shout. It glows, quietly. The fire burns steady now, not wild, not desperate, just present. It hums like it's part of you, or maybe you're part of it. You sit with your hands folded, watching the crucible. No more fussing, no more measuring, just watching. And in that stillness, a new understanding begins to rise, not from the books or the fumes, but from within. You realize you haven't thought about gold in hours, because now the lead is no longer a problem to solve. It's a partner, a quiet, dense little reminder of where the journey started and how far you've come. You remember the early days, the excitement, the need for results, the way you chased success like it owed you something. But now you've learned to stay, to endure the heat, to keep showing up, to let time work its alchemy on you. Historians often note that many alchemists left no great breakthroughs behind. No formulas, no discoveries, just a trail of notes, symbols, failures. And yet we still read them. Why? Because they documented the impossible, a human soul trying to make sense of matter. Here's something odd but lovely. One 17th century alchemist, Irenaeus Philalethes, wrote a letter describing the stone as so pure and bright that it must be hidden in darkness, lest its light blind the undeserving. Not locked away, not destroyed, just protected. You smile, because you get it now. The real secrets were never about sulfur and mercury. They were about restraint, about respect, about not demanding from the universe what you haven't yet earned from yourself. You rise and walk to a corner of the lab you hadn't noticed before. There, tucked beneath a dusty cloth, is a second crucible unused. Clean, waiting. You touch it, and something inside you stirs. Not greed, not urgency, but readiness. The kind that comes only after the burning, after the grinding, after the failure. The kind that says, "Now I understand what I didn't before." You take a deep breath. You pour the cooled lead from the first crucible into a small mold. It doesn't sparkle, it doesn't hum, but it's solid, changed, not into gold, but into memory, into proof that you stayed, that you endured. You label it Attempt 47 and set it beside the others. But this one feels different, because this time you weren't just testing the metal, you were testing your resolve. And something held. You think of all the alchemists who never found the stone but kept searching anyway. Not because they believed they would find it, but because they couldn't stop asking what else might be possible if I just try again. You pick up your quill. Write one sentence on a fresh page. Today, the lead remained lead. But I did not. And with that, you close the book. For now, the furnace will burn again tomorrow. The crucible will be filled again. But tonight, you rest not as a failure. You rest as a witness to the process, to the patience, to the quiet, unglamorous truth of what it means to believe in something without proof. Because sometimes the greatest act of transformation is simply not giving up. You don't wake with a start, just a soft blink. The lab greets you like a familiar room in a half-remembered dream. The stone floor is cool beneath your feet. The smell of charcoal lingers in your clothes. And the quiet feels earned. You light a new candle, not because the dark frightens you, but because it feels good to see clearly. On the table, the lead mold from last night. You hold it in your palm. It's heavy as ever, but it feels like a milestone, a quiet little monument to persistence. You place it beside the others, 48 of them now, each one a chapter, a heartbeat, a reminder that every failure taught you something. Today, you begin again, but not like before. This time, you're not just recreating someone else's instructions. You're beginning to write your own. You open the cabinet where your ingredients live. Rows of jars, some labeled with Latin names, others with symbols only you understand. You smile at the cinnamon bark you once mistook for sulfur, at the chunk of orpiment you swore was gold, at the vial of quicksilver that still refuses to behave. You're not afraid of them anymore. You're familiar. You select your components not by recipe, but by intuition. You know their personalities now, their moods, their stories. This is no longer chemistry. It's a conversation. One historians often overlook is that alchemists didn't just work with matter, they worked with narrative. They gave their ingredients roles, assigned them temperaments, wrote of their interactions as marriages, battles, resurrections. The crucible was a stage, and the experiment was a play. A quirky manuscript from the 15th century describes silver as the cold, pale widow of the sun, and sulfur as the unruly lion who must be chained by love. It's not science, strictly speaking, but it is beautiful, and you get it now. Because you're not just transforming metals, you're transforming how you relate to them. You grind the ingredients by hand, not because the machine is broken, but because the rhythm of the motion calms your thoughts. The soft scrape of pestle against stone feels almost like prayer. You mix the powder, heat the flask, and wait not with impatience, but with attention. You've come to realize that transformation isn't an event. It's a practice, a rhythm, a way of being in the world. Outside, the wind brushes against the shutters. Inside, the furnace crackles. You check the mixture, still cloudy, still stubborn, but there's a soft glint along the edge. Nothing magical, just possibility. And that's enough. You sit, you breathe, you write one sentence. The work continues not because it must, but because it teaches. You think of all the seekers before you, the names lost to time, the ones whose notes were burned, whose flasks were broken, whose hopes were dismissed. They kept going. So will you. Because maybe you're not trying to change lead into gold anymore. Maybe you're just trying to understand what it means to change it all. And maybe that's the real great work. The rain begins softly, tapping the shutters, whispering through cracks in the wood like it's trying to get in, or maybe trying to say something. You listen. Because after all this time, you've learned that alchemy is as much about listening as it is about doing. The crucible hisses quietly in the furnace. Today's mixture is a little different. Less lead, more patience. Less ambition, more observation. You're still working, yes, but not chasing. You've stopped expecting gold, and somehow that's made everything golden. You flip through an older notebook, volume 2, if your charcoal numbering is still legible. You smile at the chaos sketches of mythical beasts next to melting points, poetic riddles scribbled alongside boiling times. A page reads, "If I were lead, would I want to become gold?" You don't remember writing it, but it sounds like you. You turn the page, and you're back in time again. Not centuries this time, just decades. a university lab. Fluorescent lighting, stainless steel everything. You stand beside a white-coated scientist explaining how technically lead can be turned into gold using particle accelerators. Just one problem: it takes more energy than the gold is worth. You laugh now, remembering how anticlimactic it felt. How the dream of the ancients had at last been realized, and it was a financial disaster. Historians still reference this moment, how the ultimate goal of alchemy was finally achieved by physics, only to be discarded as impractical. A curiosity, a footnote. But they missed the point. Because the alchemists weren't wrong. They were just asking better questions. Not can we, but should we not? How much gold can I get? But what kind of person must I become to deserve it? You stir the mixture gently. The scent is earthy today. You added crushed eggshell for calcium and a sprig of basil not for chemistry, but for comfort. That's another thing you've learned: rituals matter. Not because they work, but because they give the work meaning. A quirky footnote: some alchemists believed the stone would reveal itself only to the one who no longer wanted it. The desire itself was the impurity. That humility, paradoxically, was the final catalyst. You peer into the crucible. No gold, not even a shimmer. But no disappointment either. Just heat, motion, and trust. You write a new line in your notebook: today I made nothing new, except peace. You think of all the voices in the lab with you: Newton Jabir, the monk, the hedge witch, the red lion dreamers. They're not haunting you, they're walking with you. Because this work was never solitary. It was never just yours. It was always ours. The rain picks up slightly. You pause, tilt your head toward it, and wonder how many alchemists stop to listen to the rain. How many, like you, realize that every drop was a kind of miracle, a form of water that forgot what it used to be. You turn back to the furnace. The flame is steady. The lead is calm. You are not waiting for gold. You are watching for truth. Because here, in this quiet corner of the world, you are doing something rare. Practicing a belief that transformation is not only possible, but worth doing slowly. The rain has stopped. In its place, a heavy quiet settles over the lab, like the world just took a deep breath and is waiting to see what you'll do next. You don't rush to fill the silence. You just stand there for a moment, listening to the absence of noise. The way the stillness wraps around the shelves and flasks like soft cloth. You place your hand over the furnace not too close and feel the heat radiating outward. It's not searing anymore. It's patient, like you. You turn back to your notes, and suddenly you realize you've stopped drawing arrows, stopped scribbling goals. The words are slower now, more thoughtful, like the writing itself has aged with you. One phrase catches your eye, circled in faint graphite: as above, so below. You've seen it 100 times. It's practically alchemy's slogan. But today it feels different. Today you wonder if the stars reflect the soul. What happens when the soul changes? You're pulled again, not into history this time, but into cosmos. Because alchemy was never just about the lab. It was about the sky. You stand beneath an imaginary dome of stars, the same one alchemists charted for centuries. Not to tell the future, but to understand the present. To connect what they could see with what they could only feel. They believed each metal was governed by a celestial body: gold by the sun, silver by the moon, iron by Mars, copper by Venus, lead by Saturn. And so they looked upward, not for gods, but for guides. Historians still debate how seriously alchemists took astrology. Some insist it was symbolic. Others say they timed their experiments by moon phases, planetary hours, and eclipses. One thing is certain, they saw patterns, and patterns meant hope. A quirky belief, certain texts insisted that true transformation couldn't occur unless the stars were aligned. That the macrocosm the universe had to sing in tune with the microcosm, the alchemist's own soul. You sit now looking at your own reflection in a flask. It's warped, faint, distorted by the curve of the glass, but it's still you. And you think, what if I'm the element that's ruled by the stars? What if the real experiment isn't in the furnace, but in learning to live in alignment? You open your notebook again and draw a simple diagram, a star above a figure below a thin line connecting them. Then you label the line awareness. You've come a long way from trying to cook gold out of metal. Now you're learning how to listen to light. You step outside barefoot on the cool stone. The storm has passed. The moon is visible now, low and swollen with the pride of having endured the clouds. A few stars peer out cautiously behind it. You whisper, not because anyone is listening, but because you are. Tonight, I align with the sky. Back in the lab, the furnace still glows. The lead is unchanged, but you are not. Because now you don't just know the phrase as above, so below. You feel it. You live it. And the fire inside you burns not for wealth, but for wisdom. You return to the table and sit with a quiet that no longer feels like waiting, it feels like rest. The lead in the crucible glows gently nestled in coals like an egg waiting to hatch. But you no longer check it with expectation. It's not the result that matters. It's the presence. You're no longer measuring progress in ounces or colors. You're measuring it in stillness, in how long you can sit without needing to fix, adjust, or change something. That too is a kind of transmutation. You leaf back through your notes, not the recent ones, the oldest ones. You find the first line you ever wrote in this journal, I will make gold, or I will die trying. You smile, not because it was wrong, but because it was honest. And yet, how far you've come. Now the thought of turning lead into gold feels almost quaint, like someone trying to net the moon with a spoon. Because you've discovered something rarer than gold, a peaceful mind. And maybe that was always the real stone. You glance at the furnace. The flame flickers lower. It's getting tired too. You rise and check the shelves, tidying without thinking. You align the jars. You dust the old alembic. You find a broken beaker you never threw out. You hold it to the light. Its crack runs like a vein down the middle. It's useless for work, but beautiful. You set it back anyway. Because that's what this place is now, not just a lab, but a museum of persistence, a sanctuary of effort. Every crack is a testament. You pick up a scrap of paper tucked beneath a mortar. On it is an old diagram of the alchemical wedding, a common image in the lore. A red king and white queen joined in union, standing on a serpent crowned by the sun. Historians still debate its meaning. Some say it represents the union of sulfur and mercury. Others argue it's the soul and the spirit merging. A few see it as purely symbolic, the marriage of opposites. But you see integration, the moment when the self stops fighting itself, when ambition and humility shake hands, when striving becomes serenity. You set the image down and look around your lab, really look, and it hits you there is nothing more to add. No more stages to chase, no more symbols to decode. You haven't turned lead into gold, but you've turned searching into finding. You return to the table, pick up the crucible, and pour its contents carefully into a small dish. The lead settles. Dull gray, heavy, plain. But as the light catches it, you notice something, a thin line of red along the edge. Barely visible, but unmistakable. You laugh, not with triumph, with gratitude, not because the gold has come, but because now you no longer need it. You write your final entry of the night. The work is never finished. But I am no longer lost in it. I carry it now. You close the notebook, gently, like a final chapter, or the beginning of a new one. And as you sit, hands warm from the crucible, the lab around you glows, not with gold, but with meaning. Because in the end, the secret wasn't hidden in a stone, a symbol, or a formula. It was you. The whole time. You rise early before the sun has fully stretched its arms across the sky. There's a hush in the world, one that belongs only to mornings like this. The kind of quiet that doesn't demand anything. It just welcomes you. You light a fresh candle not because you need light, but because you enjoy the gesture. The flame catches wobbles and then holds, like a breath remembered. The lab is cool. The tools are sleeping. Even the lead seems to rest peacefully in its dish, no longer begging for transformation. It's not a project anymore. It's a witness. You find yourself wondering, what is alchemy now in this century? In this moment, you look around, not for magic, but for truth. And you see it everywhere. In the beaker half cracked from your first experiment. In the stain on the floor from an old spill. In the words you underlined in your notebook so hard they bled through the page. You didn't just study alchemy. You lived it. And that life left marks. You sit again and open a clean page, blank, no pressure, no plan. And for the first time, you write not for the work, but for the world. To the future alchemist, if you are reading this, you're already closer than you think. Because here's the truth, the philosopher's stone was never a thing. It was always a language, a code for the kind of courage that keeps showing up. You're reminded of a passage you once copied from a forgotten grimoire. The fire refines, the water purifies, but it is the silence that reveals. You finally understand what that means. It wasn't the metals that needed changing, it was how you saw them. Lead is not failure. Lead is foundation. And gold is what happens when acceptance burns hot enough. You walk to the shelf where your 49 molds sit, each marked with a date, each its own quiet echo of hope. You hold them one by one, not with judgment, but with affection. You made these, not for kings, not for fortune, but because something inside you refused to stop seeking. You think of all the modern alchemists now, not cloaked in robes, but in lab coats, gardener's gloves, artists' smocks, therapists' cardigans. People who still believe that change is possible, that matter can shift, that we are not stuck. Historians may dismiss the old alchemists as quaint, misguided, dreamers, but you know better, because you're one of them. Not because you turn metals into miracles, but because you never gave up on becoming more than you were yesterday. And you pass that torch now, not as a master, but as a fellow traveler. You write, here's what I've learned. Fire teaches. Lead humbles. Gold, when it comes, surprises you by not being shiny at all. You close the book. The flame dances quietly nearby. The wind outside carries the scent of morning, and for once you feel no urge to begin a new experiment, because the alchemy is already happening right here, right now. In you, the day unfolds without urgency. You move through the lab not like a seeker, but like a caretaker. Each object you touch responds as if it recognizes you now. The shelves no longer whisper secrets, they simply offer space. You aren't searching anymore. You're stewarding. The flask you once shattered in frustration now holds dried lavender. The crucible with its pitted base rests clean on a polished stone still warm from yesterday's fire. The pages you once tore out in anger have been taped back in, not to hide the scars, but to honor them. Because this too is part of the work. Not just the fire and the transmutation, but the forgiveness, the mending, the learning to walk beside your own failures without flinching. You prepare tea, not an elixir, just tea. It steams in a humble clay cup you molded yourself last winter when the furnace was cold and your hands needed something to do. You sip it slowly. The warmth spreads, not like a catalyst, but like permission to be here, to pause, to belong. You sit and open one of the earliest books you copied, its spine cracked, its pages fragrant with time. A phrase jumps out at you, one you underlined 100 days ago. The work begins in ignorance. It ends in simplicity. Historians still argue whether this line was literal or symbolic, whether it referred to chemical processes or spiritual truths. But you've lived through enough cycles now to know it was both. You place the book beside your newest mold, Attempt 50. Not perfect, not gold, but different. It shines not with luster, but with quiet knowing. The kind that can't be seen until you've stopped needing to look. You think again of the classic alchemical stages, nigredo, albedo, citrinitas, rubedo. But now you wonder what comes after rubedo? The texts are silent, or maybe they're waiting for you to write it. You take your pen and on a fresh page draw a fifth circle, no color this time. Just an outline. Open. Incomplete. You label it continuatio, because the work never truly ends. It just softens, deepens, learns to walk barefoot without fear of the ash. You step outside. The sun is low, not quite setting. The air smells like earth and iron, smoke elements you've grown to love. Not for what they promised, but for who they've made you. You look at your hands. Scarred, ink-stained, steady. You've done the work, and the work has done you. You return inside and begin cleaning, not out of duty, but with reverence. Each jar is wiped, each tool sharpened. The notebooks are stacked, tied with cord, and placed in a weathered wooden box marked only with a circle and a dot. No signature, no boast, just a symbol that says, "This mattered." You extinguish the candle. The light fades, but not the warmth. You smile and say not to the room, not even to the lead, but to yourself, "Tomorrow, if I wake, I will begin again." Not because I must, but because I can. The night folds gently around the lab, like the last page of a well-worn book. You move slowly now, not from weariness, but from peace. The crucible has cooled. The furnace hums low like a song remembered more in feeling than in melody. The tools are in their places, the shelves undisturbed, the notebook closed, and you are ready. Not to leave the work behind, but to carry it differently now. Lighter, quieter, closer to the heart. You sit one last time at the bench where so many evenings began in restless fire and ended in soft ash. Where you chased gold and found yourself. Tonight the lab is not a place of doing. It is a place of becoming. You run your hand along the edge of the table, each groove familiar. Every nick and scorch mark tells a story. Not of success or failure, but of intention. You look to the corner shelf where your 50 molds sit side by side. Gray, heavy, honest, and more beautiful than any gilded chalice could ever be. Because they are proof that you showed up. Again, and again, and again. You think back to your first night when the lead felt like a challenge. A locked door. A riddle you were desperate to solve. And now it feels like an old friend. Still solid, still silent, but no longer stubborn, because you stopped demanding change and started offering companionship. A final whisper from memory, the voice of a long-forgotten alchemist, once wrote, "The stone does not make the gold. It makes the gold maker." You rise, and with steady hands, you place your final mold among the others. Not labeled, not numbered, just placed. As if to say, this one wasn't for the record. It was for me. You douse the fire. The lab dims, and in that dimming, something opens. Not an ending, not even a beginning. Just continuation. The work will live on, in others, in words, in the quiet ripple of those who believe still that transformation is possible. You whisper the only truth left to say, the gold was never the metal. It was always the act of hope. And with that, you turn, you exhale, you let go. Word count 100. Wind down begins below. Let the flame go out now. The crucible is cool. The lab is silent. And you are safe. You've traveled a long way tonight, not through countries or centuries, but through something far deeper. Through longing, through effort, through the echoing halls of what it means to try. You've met those who failed nobly, and those who pretended to succeed. You've seen experiments that fizzled, symbols that whispered, and questions that refused to answer themselves. But most of all, you've watched your own reflection shift. Just a little. From seeker to student, from student to steward, from steward to something closer to whole. The lead is still led. And yet, doesn't it feel lighter, not because it's changed, but because you have? So as you settle in now, deeper into your pillow, into the hum of the night, into the gentle rhythm of breath, let the work rest with you. Let it wrap around your chest like warmth. Let it shimmer behind your eyes like firelight. Let it whisper, you are the gold. No one can take that from you. Not time, not doubt, not even failure. You carry the stone now, not in your hand, but in your heart. Sweet dreams.